We now have hundreds of television stations, and with the internet outside of private, regular citizens, an infinite number of television stations, all saying one thing. One thing. They all say one thing. People have a lot of opinions and no facts. And that's basically what it is. They're so connected to the media. I was born in 1954. I turned 5 in 1959, started school then, went through, secondary school over in 1972, and then studied, from there on. When I was 5 years old, my parents would not allow us to have a television set. We didn't have one. They wanted us to read. So my contact with the real world, or with the world as I was being socialized, consisted of what reading, the radio, mostly music, and a little bit of news. The reading was mostly newspapers and then books because I read everything. And just people, like actual person-to-person contact. There was no virtual contact. It was all real, with the exception of reading and sound. As I got older, we kind of fed into the paradigm that developed. We were kind of late stage. People my age, other people my age mostly, grew up in front of a television set. And they're different. Their understanding of things is different. Now, there's an immersion in all of the technology. And the socialization now of kids, say for the last 10, 15 years even, there's through these little boxes. My nieces sit next to each other on a couch, and nobody says a word. They all, type there. So in other words, their socialization is virtual. So the people that come out of school, college, grad school, professional law school, I've trained law school students, for example, on different things. Their understanding of the world is, in a sense, very shallow. And they take a great deal of claims at face value as if they're true. And so if all they're hearing about China's killing Uyghurs, China's trying to make Muslims become atheists, and all of this nonsense, if that's all they're hearing, that's the universe for them. That's what they honestly believe. So when we're talking about this, I'm sorry to go this long circle. I just want to give you an understanding of my perspective. When we're talking about what do people think here or something, the first reflex I have is to say they're not thinking. I can't tell you what they're thinking. They'll tell you something if you ask a question, but I don't think there's an actual thought process involved. I don't think they're taking this fact and testing them and synthesizing and comprehending something at all. I think it's something quite different that's inserted into them that comes out when you push the print button. That said, what will come out of their mouth is almost exactly what the media tells them. People that see all the work that I do, and they pat me on the back for it and such, my family, my friends, whatever, will then turn around when I say I'm going to China and say, are you going to be safe? Like, I was in Siberia as an election inspector last month. And I've been to Russia twice before that, once for a month. And when I told my friends, I'm going there, they were genuinely worried about my safety. And the same with China. They think I'm going to end up in a re-education camp or some crazy, I'm serious. This is what they believe. Lots of people believe this myth here, but it's really difficult to even call it a belief because it isn't that deep. If I took one of these people with me on a trip to China, there would be an apostle here preaching China because it would be such a revelation to them that, things were so different than they believed before that now they have to believe this, whatever it is. It's pretty scary when you consider this is the engine behind the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus and sort of the top structure or part of the top structure of the whole empire, that they can do just about anything and not really face a threat from the people here. I see what's this stuff going on in Georgia today. To me, it looks like the U.S. Intel is trying to do another Maidan. They've got this the Foreign Agent Registration Act that the government wants to regulate some of the nonprofits that are in the country, like CIA. And the government, which is kind of captive, the elements of it are kind of captive of the West already, and the outside, and these nonprofits are tying, and the EU are dangling the possibility of Georgia joining the EU, which some people will make a lot of money if that happens. But they're tying it to this law and basically telling the people of Georgia that if this law regulating these nonprofits is passed, you'll never get in the EU. And that's caused, it's the same thing that happened in Ukraine, was used as bait to organize this anti-government, protest. First of all, if you can understand anything, you should always have multiple alternative presentations of fact to consider. If I tell you someone is 5'11" and I tell you nothing else about them, you really don't know anything about them. Now go find him. He's 5 foot. It's person is 5'11". Is it a he or a she? Do they weigh 5 pounds or 500 pounds? Do they limp on their left leg? The more data you have, the larger your data set, the more of an understanding you have about things. Here, across the board, and this is a phenomenon that I watched it develop. When I was 5 years old, I used to go to the store over the course of the day. In New York City, there were 6, 7 daily newspapers, and then there was a local one where I was in Irvington, New York, and in Ossining, New York. And it was my job to go assemble them as they came in, pick up the morning papers, pick up the afternoon paper, pick up the evening paper, because they came that way, and leave them for my father to read. I read them all myself. I learned the second or third day that I did that I had to fold them back just so and whatever. And so each of these papers, you would see stories, some big ones. Like I remember what they call the Cuban Missile Crisis here, for example, when in October 1962. I was 8 years old. I remember reading the Journal American, the Daily News, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Herald Tribune, and the Daily Mirror. They were talking about different things. On some issues like that, there was a unity of, I'll call it now, ideological perspective with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet Union was wrong, Cuba is evil, and we're right. That was true across the spectrum of coverage. But there were some very significant differences in the narrative and also in which facts were presented in different papers. And you also had multiplicity of television stations later, like this existed then. I didn't see it, but from 65 on, I saw it. We had CBS, NBC, ABC, something called Metro Media, which is now Fox, something else that was adjacent to the Daily News and Chicago Tribune, and then a PBS, a public station. Each one had their own news department, and each of the news departments presented what they thought was important. Sometimes there was a story in one that wasn't in any of the others, and it was of some significance. Other times they all covered the same story, but they told, different tales. This changed over time, and I was watching it close. I was from the, say, 1978 forward. I was involved as a public access television producer. In 1978, 79, while this was starting, saw that and got involved. And so from there, I was watching both the law around communications and also the practice and the business that was going on. During the 80s, shortly after I got involved, Ronald Reagan removed a regulation that was called the Fairness Doctrine that put a public service requirement on the private carriers. Most media in the United States privately owned, even though you had the idea that these holders of these licenses to broadcast should not be able to control or dominate the public discussion. So if they're going to present some controversial issue or someone that's presenting a controversial issue, they have to give equal time and prominence in terms of placement in their programming to someone of the opposite view. Now, I realize in reality it's not binary like that, and what they did was a binary system. That was called the Fairness Doctrine. That was the extent of public involvement in the broadcasting. They eliminated that in the 80s. In the 90s, both the rise of the internet and all kinds of social media starting to bud, they negotiated an entirely new regime for telecommunications in the United States called the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This was Bill Clinton and Al Gore and what are now the tech giants. And what that did was place control of the internet in the hands of these, in essence, private interests. I mean, you have internet, you have Google and Microsoft and all these monsters. And as these things happened, the ownership of the newspapers, where I had 7, now there's 2, and they're owned by the same company, and the New York Times, so there's 3, because the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post are both owned by Murdoch, for example. And those 2 and the New York Times are the New York City newspapers now. I mean, there's little inconsequential ones, but that's it. Same happened with television. You now have Fox, CNN, MSNBC. That's essentially, and then CBS and ABC and NBC. That's essentially the media landscape. I think the first time I really noticed it, which was before the 96 Telecom Act, was in the propaganda for the first war in Iraq in 1990/91, where no matter where you turned, everyone was talking about tying yellow ribbons around trees and incubator babies and the whole bit. There wasn't really a dissenting voice anywhere. You know what? We used to have our televisions had stations in New York, metropolitan New York, channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. 7 stations. You'd had 6, 7 distinct points of view at that time. We now have hundreds of television stations, and with the internet outside of private, regular citizens, an infinite number of television stations, all saying one thing. One thing. They all say one thing. And that's our entire media scape. So it's a tough environment for anything else.